Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Happy Friday. One of the first questions that rational people asked, and there still are some rational people out there, after the coronavirus arrived in the U.S. last year was simple. Where did this disease come from? Now, finding out was more than a matter of simple curiosity. It was an urgent public health imperative. If you want to prevent the next disaster, you have to determine how the current disaster happened. That's why they have the NTSB. If we didn't investigate plane crashes very carefully, planes would keep crashing and you would never fly. So as this virus spread around the world last year, the rest of us waited for some credible public health authority, the CDC, the WHO, anyone, to come forward with details on where it came from. But no one ever did come forward. Instead, they told us what was, in retrospect, a completely ridiculous story. They said a seafood market in central China was, for reasons that no one ever explained, selling mammals, exotic ones like pangolins, and those pangolins somehow became a vector for infection. So the Chinese eat weird food, that's why the world is sick. That's what they told us. In China, they knew that wasn't true. They knew it very early. On February 6th of 2020, right at the very beginning, scientists from the South China University of Technology uploaded a paper on the origins of coronavirus onto the internet. They had a very different view of what happened. The virus, these scientists said, likely came from an animal called the intermediate horseshoe bat. It's interesting, they said, because there are no known colonies of intermediate horseshoe bats within 900 kilometers of Wuhan, nor were these bats sold in the famous wet market there. In fact, the scientists interviewed nearly 60 people who worked or shopped in the wet market, and all confirmed no horseshoe bats for sale. So they believe COVID jumped from bats to people. When and where and how did that happen? Well, the scientists noted the obvious. Within a few hundred yards of the Wuhan wet market was something called the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention. It turns out that facility used intermediate horseshoe bats for research. Then about 7 miles away was another facility. This one was called the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The Wuhan Institute of Virology also conducted research on intermediate horseshoe bats. So for these Chinese scientists who were working on the ground at the epicenter of the outbreak, at the very beginning of the outbreak, the conclusion was obvious. Quote, the killer coronavirus probably originated from a laboratory in Wuhan. Again, that was the first week of February in 2020. That research sat on the internet for weeks before the Chinese authorities finally pulled it down, and they have. We don't know what happened to the people who wrote it, but we have a copy. The amazing thing is, even though this was public, health officials in the West ignored it completely. When they were asked about the possibility that this virus had come from a lab in Wuhan, they became hostile. In some cases, they became hysterical. For example, in a post on the National Institutes of Health website, NIH Director Francis Collins, who should know better, dismissed all questions about a lab leak in Wuhan as, quote, outrageous, like you were sinful for asking the question. But those questions were not outrageous, they were entirely plausible. Last fall, we spoke to someone with firsthand knowledge of this subject. Dr. Li Mengyan is an eminent Chinese virologist who worked on COVID in China in the early days of the pandemic. She was certain, based on what she had seen, that this virus came from a lab in Wuhan. On September 15, 2020, Dr. Yan came on this show and said so.
From my first report, I can present the solid scientific evidence to our audience that this virus, COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 virus, actually is not from nature. I work with the top coronavirologists in the world. So together with my experience, I can tell you, this is created in the lab. This is from that template owned by China military. And also it is spread to the world to make such damage.
To make such damage, do you believe the Chinese government released this intentionally, on purpose? Did they do this?
Yes, of course, it's intentionally.
That was a strong claim, but Li Mengyan had even stronger credentials. Once again, she was a Chinese virologist who personally did research on COVID in China at the very beginning of the outbreak. So she was not an internet fabulist. She had informed firsthand knowledge about how this pandemic started. Not many people can say that she could, and she did, but no one listened to her. Instead, the usual liars went to work immediately to discredit her personally. The so-called fact-checking website PolitiFact attacked Dr. Yan's claims as, quote, inaccurate and ridiculous. Now, PolitiFact never explained how they could know that. Did the gender studies majors at PolitiFact have access to superior science? We're thinking they didn't. But they went ahead anyway and accused Dr. Yan of being a, quote, pants-on-fire liar. She should have sued them. That claim was enough for big tech. The media monopolies immediately swooped in to make the whole topic disappear. Facebook censored our interview with Dr. Yan and then deleted it completely. Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, followed suit. Both those companies used PolitiFact's claims to justify their own censorship, and then, of course, CNN swooped in at the end to celebrate the whole thing.
The other day, Carlson interviewed a quote-unquote whistleblower who claimed that she had evidence of a COVID-19 conspiracy in Wuhan, China. But when videos of the interview were shared on social media, Facebook and Instagram intervened by putting a false information label on it.
Catch that? According to CNN, the media monopolies intervened. Right. So this was not a matter of soulless left-wing corporations committing censorship in order to cover for their masters in the Chinese Communist Party. No, not at all. It was instead an intervention. It was done for your good. At the time, of course, there was a political subtext. Donald Trump was the president, and partisans in the media felt they had no choice but to kill this story. If China turned out to be responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic, then Donald Trump would be less responsible for the pandemic, and he might be reelected. So they kept lying for partisan reasons about this virus and the science around it. You saw reporters do the same thing with their coverage of the drug hydroxychloroquine. Once Trump touted hydroxychloroquine, they called it poison, etc. But it's a new day now. Joe Biden's in the White House. They got him elected. So some journalists have decided it is safe and they can now drop the pose. You've seen it over the past several months. A number of prominent liberals have publicly reassessed their views on where this virus came from. Yes, they have admitted, the virus did emerge from a lab in Wuhan. The physical evidence for that is overwhelming. This virus did not evolve in nature. Read the pieces, they're interesting. This virus was instead enhanced during lab experiments. Reckless, ghoulish, very dangerous experiments. They were paid for in part by American taxpayers from grants that Tony Fauci himself signed off on. That is all true. They're admitting it now. Even PolitiFact has retracted its claim that Dr. Yan is a pants-on-fire liar. And again, she should sue them. They should be ashamed. Facebook, interestingly, has not reassessed. Apparently, Facebook does far too much business in China to offend the Chinese military. So as of tonight, our interview with Dr. Yan is still missing from Facebook. But Dr. Yan herself is very much still here.